As I was getting ready to go to my son's for dinner, my lawyer texted, "Call me immediately." I dialed his number. What he told me about my son made my blood run cold. If you are watching this video, tell me where you are watching from. I was standing in front of my bedroom mirror, applying the deep rose lipstick I always wore for family dinners. My phone buzzed on the dresser. I glanced at the screen. David Lawson, my lawyer. The text was only 3 words, but they were enough to make my hand freeze midair, lipstick hovering above my lips. "Call me immediately." My heart lurched. David never texted like that. Never. In the 15 years he'd represented me and my company, Miller and Associates, he'd always been measured, professional, calm. This was different. This was urgent. I set down the lipstick with trembling fingers and dialed his number. He picked up on the first ring. "Kate." His voice was tight, stripped of its usual warmth. "David, what's wrong?" I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the edge of fear creeping in. I sank onto the edge of my bed, the navy dress wrinkling beneath me. "Tell me." There was a pause, a terrible, heavy pause that seemed to stretch for hours. Then David spoke, and the words that came out of his mouth shattered my world. "Kate, it's about Michael." My breath caught. "Michael, is he okay? Did something happen? He's fine. Physically." Another pause. "Kate, I need you to listen carefully. We've uncovered something I never thought I'd have to tell you." The room started to tilt. I gripped the edge of the mattress, my knuckles white. "What are you talking about?" My voice sounded distant, like it was coming from someone else's throat. "Your son has been forging your signature." The words didn't make sense. They floated in the air like foreign objects, refusing to land, refusing to take shape into anything real. "What?" I whispered, my throat suddenly bone dry. "Michael has been creating false documents. Transfer papers, corporate filings. He's been planning to take control of your company, to steal the company out from under you." David's voice was steady, professional, but I could hear the underlying anger simmering beneath his words. The room was too hot, too small. The walls were closing in. "No." The word came out as a whisper. "No, David, that's not possible. Michael wouldn't, he would never." But even as I said it, something cold and sharp twisted in my gut. "Kate." David's voice was firm but gentle, the way you'd speak to someone in shock. "I have the documents, forged signatures, falsified board minutes, fraudulent stock transfers. He's been working on this for months. My son, my Michael, the boy I'd rocked to sleep, the young man I'd put through college, the person I'd built an entire empire for, had been plotting against me for months. While I was signing contracts, attending board meetings, planning for our future, he was forging my name on documents designed to strip me of everything." I looked at the dress on the bed, the lipstick on the dresser, the dinner invitation that had felt so warm, so normal just 10 minutes ago. Michael had called me 3 days ago, his voice familiar and loving. "Mom, please come over Friday night. I want to talk to you about something important, about the business, about our future together, our future together." My stomach twisted violently. Was tonight supposed to be the trap? Was he going to make me sign something under the guise of discussing the business? Was he going to coerce me, manipulate me, record me saying something he could twist later in court? "Kate, are you still there?" David's voice pulled me back. "Yes," I managed, though my voice cracked. "Yes, I'm here." I pressed my free hand against my chest, feeling my heart hammering beneath my ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. "There's more." David's tone dropped even lower. "Kate, Michael isn't working alone." The floor seemed to drop out from beneath me. "What do you mean?" I asked, though some primal part of me already knew. Some buried instinct was screaming the answer before David could speak it. "There's someone else involved, someone from your past." He paused, and in that silence, I heard everything he wasn't saying. "Kate, it's Richard, my ex-husband, the man I'd escaped 15 years ago, the man who'd controlled every aspect of my life, who'd made me feel small and worthless and dependent, the man who'd promised I'd never survive without him, the man I'd proven wrong. And now he was back, not in person but through something far more insidious, through our son. He'd turned Michael against me, poisoned him, used him as a weapon designed specifically to destroy me. I thought I'd left Richard Miller behind when I walked out with nothing but a suitcase and Michael's hand in mine. I thought I'd won by building a life he said I'd never have. But he'd been waiting, watching, planning his revenge all along. And he'd used the one person I loved most in the world to deliver it. Kate? David's voice was softer now, worried. Talk to me. Are you okay? It was a ridiculous question. Of course I wasn't okay. My son was trying to steal my company. My ex-husband was orchestrating it from the shadows. But I'd survived worse. I'd survived Richard once before. I'd rebuilt my life from ashes, and I would survive this too, even if it broke my heart in the process. I'm here, I said, forcing steel into my voice. Tell me everything, David. I need to know exactly what we're dealing with, because if there was one thing 15 years of fighting had taught me, it was this: knowledge was power. And I wasn't going down without a fight. Michael has been working with Richard for at least 18 months, David began. We found email correspondence between them. Richard has been coaching him, guiding him through every step of this scheme. The forgeries, the false documents, it's all part of a coordinated plan to take Miller and Associates away from you. 18 months, a year and a half of lies, of secret meetings and whispered phone calls, of my son looking me in the eye over dinner and smiling while plotting my destruction. How had I missed it? How had I been so blind? Kate, if we hadn't caught this when we did, you would have lost everything by next week, David continued. The final transfer documents were already prepared. All they needed was one more signature, yours, and it would have been done. Michael would have owned 80% of your company, and you would have had no legal recourse. 1 week. I was 1 week away from losing everything I'd spent 15 years building. 1 dinner invitation away from financial ruin. 1 forged signature away from being exactly where Richard wanted me, broken and powerless. What do we do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We fight back, David said firmly. I'm filing an emergency injunction first thing Monday morning to freeze all company assets. We'll present the evidence of forgery to the court. Kate, we have everything we need to stop this. The emails, the forged documents, the paper trail connecting Richard to the scheme, it's all there. I should have felt relief, should have felt grateful that David had caught it in time. But all I felt was a crushing, suffocating grief. Because even if we won in court, even if I kept my company and exposed their scheme, I'd already lost something far more valuable. I'd lost my son. Don't go to that dinner tonight, David warned. We don't know what they're planning. If Michael is desperate, if Richard is pushing him, there's no telling what might happen. Stay home. Let me handle this legally. I looked at the dress on the bed again. The navy blue fabric that was supposed to make my eyes sparkle. The dinner that was supposed to be about our future together. It had all been a lie. I won't go, I said quietly. Good. I'll call you tomorrow with more details. Kate. David paused. I'm so sorry. I know this isn't easy, but we're going to get through this. You're going to get through this. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Thank you, David. My voice cracked on the last word. Thank you for catching it in time. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed, still holding the phone, staring at the dress I would never wear, the lipstick I'd never finish applying, the dinner that would never happen. From the outside, my life had always looked perfect, a beautiful home, a thriving business, a devoted son. But it had all been a carefully constructed illusion, and tonight it had finally shattered. My son, my own flesh and blood, had betrayed me. And the man I'd spent 15 years trying to forget had orchestrated it all from the shadows, using Michael like a puppet on strings. The perfume still hung in the air, sweet and suffocating. I stood slowly, walked to the dresser and picked up the bottle of Chanel No. 5. For a moment, I considered throwing it across the room, watching it shatter against the wall the way my heart was shattering now. But I didn't. Instead, I set it down gently and looked at myself in the mirror. At 63, I'd thought I'd seen everything, survived everything, overcome everything. I was wrong, because the worst betrayal doesn't come from strangers or enemies. It comes from the people you love most, the people you'd sacrifice everything for, the people you trust with your whole heart. And now, standing in my bedroom with the ghost of a family dinner haunting the air, I realized something terrifying. I had no idea who my son really was, or if I'd ever really known him at all. My phone buzzed again. A text from Michael. Mom, you're still coming tonight, right? Can't wait to see you. Love you. Love you. The words that used to warm my heart now felt like acid burning through my chest. I stared at the message for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Then I turned off my phone, walked to my closet, and carefully hung the navy dress back up. I removed the lipstick from my lips with a tissue. I took off the pearl earrings I'd chosen to match the dress. And then I sat back down on my bed and did something I hadn't done in 15 years, not when Richard screamed at me. Not when I left with nothing. Not when I worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. Not even when I signed the papers for my first office. I cried. Not the quiet, dignified tears of grief, but the raw, ugly sobs of a mother whose child had just driven a knife into her heart and twisted it, because tonight wasn't just about losing a company or fighting a legal battle. Tonight was about realizing that the person I'd built my entire life around, the person I'd sacrificed everything for, had looked me in the eye and chosen to destroy me. And I didn't know if I'd ever recover from that. If you've ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted most, stay with me. This story gets darker before the light comes. 15 years ago, I walked out of my marriage with nothing but a battered suitcase and my son's hand in mine. Michael was only 13 then, small for his age, his fingers gripping mine so tightly I could feel his fear. Richard stood in the doorway of the house we'd shared for 16 years, his face twisted with rage and something darker, satisfaction. He knew what leaving meant. He knew I had no money, no job, no plan. "You'll be back," he'd said, his voice cold and certain. "You'll come crawling back within a month, Catherine. You're nothing without me. You've never been anything without me." I'd looked him in the eye, my suitcase heavy in one hand, my son's trembling hand in the other, and said the words that would define the rest of my life: "Watch me." I was 48 years old. I had no college degree, no work experience beyond being Richard's wife, no savings of my own. Everything, the house, the cars, the bank accounts, was in his name. He'd made sure of that. For 16 years, he'd controlled every dollar, every decision, every aspect of my existence. When I asked for money to buy groceries, he made me explain every item. When I wanted to take a class, he told me I wasn't smart enough. When I suggested getting a job, he laughed and said no one would hire someone like me. He'd spent years convincing me I was worthless, and for a long time I'd believed him. But the moment I walked out that door with Michael, something inside me shifted. I wasn't going to let Richard be right. I wasn't going to let my son grow up thinking his mother was weak. I was going to prove that I was so much more than Richard Miller ever allowed me to be. The first year was hell. We lived in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment that smelled like mildew and old carpet. I worked 2 jobs, waiting tables during the day, cleaning offices at night. Michael would do his homework at the diner where I worked, sitting in a back booth with his textbook spread out, trying to pretend he didn't hear the other customers whisper about us. About the woman who left her husband and dragged her kid into poverty. I'd come home at midnight, my feet aching, my back screaming, and find Michael asleep on the couch, his homework still open on his lap. I'd carry him to bed, tuck him in, and then sit at our tiny kitchen table and cry. Not because I regretted leaving, but because I was terrified I'd fail him. Terrified that Richard was right, that I wasn't strong enough, smart enough, capable enough to give Michael the life he deserved. But I didn't give up. I couldn't. Because every time I wanted to quit, I'd look at Michael and remember why I'd left. I didn't want him growing up in a house where love was conditional, where control masqueraded as care, where a man could make a woman feel small just because he could. So I enrolled in night classes at the community college. Business administration, accounting, marketing. I studied after Michael went to bed, my eyes burning with exhaustion, my mind foggy from working 16-hour days. My professors probably thought I was crazy, a middle-aged waitress with no degree, no experience, no business being there, but I showed up, every single class. And slowly, painfully, I learned. Michael was my reason for everything. When I was too tired to study, I'd think of him. When I wanted to give up, I'd remember his face the day we left, the way he'd looked at me with such trust, such faith that I'd keep him safe. I couldn't let him down. By the time I was 50, I'd earned my degree. Not with honors, not with scholarships or accolades, just with sheer stubborn determination. And with that degree, I started Miller & Associates, a small consulting firm that operated out of a rented office barely bigger than a closet. I had 3 clients that first year. 3. But it was mine. Built with my own hands, my own mind, my own refusal to let Richard's words define me. Michael was 18 by then, about to graduate high school. He'd spent those 5 years watching me fight, watching me fail and get back up, watching me turn nothing into something. And on the day I signed the lease for that tiny office, he looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, "Mom, I'm so proud of you. You're amazing." I'd hugged him so tight I thought my ribs might crack. "We did this together, sweetheart," I'd whispered. "Everything I've built is for you, for us," and I'd meant it. Every word. Because Michael wasn't just my son. He was my reason for surviving, my reason for becoming someone Richard said I could never be. The business grew, slowly at first, then faster. By the time I was 55, Miller and Associates had 20 employees, a downtown office, and clients across 3 states. By 60, we'd gone international. I'd built an empire from nothing, and through it all, Michael was there, graduating college, starting to work with me, learning the business. I thought we were building something together, a legacy, a future. I kept a photo on my desk, taken on the day we opened our downtown office 10 years ago. Michael and me standing in front of the gleaming glass doors with Miller and Associates etched above them. His arm around my shoulders, both of us grinning like we'd won the lottery. He'd looked at me that day and said, "You did it, Mom. You proved everyone wrong. You're incredible." Sitting in my bedroom now, David's words still echoing in my ears, I thought about that photo. About Michael's smile. His words, his pride. Had any of it been real? Or had he been pretending even then, already plotting with Richard, already seeing me not as his mother but as an obstacle to overcome? When did it change? When did my son, the boy I'd carried on my back through the hardest years of our lives, decide that I was his enemy? When did greed replace love? When did Richard's poison finally take root so deep that Michael couldn't see me anymore, couldn't see the sacrifices, couldn't see anything but what he thought he deserved? I'd built Miller and Associates for him. Every late night, every risk, every dollar earned. It was all for Michael. I'd wanted to give him security, opportunity, a future where he'd never have to depend on anyone the way I'd depended on Richard. I'd wanted him to be strong, independent, capable. But somewhere along the way, I'd created something else. I'd created a man who looked at everything I'd built and thought, "This should be mine." A man who didn't see a mother who'd sacrificed everything for him. He saw a woman standing between him and what he wanted. I thought about the dinner invitation, the warmth in his voice. "Mom, I want to talk about our future together." Had he practiced those words? Had Richard coached him on how to sound sincere, how to make me trust him one last time so he could finish what they'd started? How long had he been lying to me? How many times had he sat across from me at dinner, smiled at me, hugged me, told me he loved me, all while forging my signature on documents designed to strip me of everything? I stood up slowly, my legs still unsteady, and walked to my home office. The photo sat on my desk, right where it had always been. Michael and me, mother and son, partners, or so I'd thought. I picked up the frame with shaking hands and stared at our faces. We looked so happy, so united, so genuine, but now all I could see was the lie, the performance, the betrayal already forming behind his eyes. "When did I lose you?" I whispered to the image of my son. "When did you stop being mine and start being his? Because that's what this was really about." Richard hadn't just poisoned Michael against me, he'd reclaimed him, turned him back into a Miller. Not the Miller I'd tried to create, strong and honest and kind, but the Miller Richard had always been, controlling, manipulative, willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way. I set the photo back down, but I didn't turn it face down. I didn't hide it away. Because despite everything, despite the forgeries and the lies and the conspiracy, that boy in the photo was still my son. And some part of me, the part that had carried him, raised him, sacrificed everything for him, still loved him, even if he'd stopped loving me years ago. If you've ever sacrificed everything for someone only to wonder if they ever truly appreciated it, you're not alone. Keep watching. The signs were always there. I just didn't want to see them. Or maybe I did see them, buried somewhere deep in my gut, but I pushed them down because acknowledging them felt like betraying my own son, like admitting that the person I loved most in the world might be capable of hurting me. It started small. About a year ago, documents began disappearing from my home office. At first I thought I was just getting forgetful. 63 years old, maybe my memory wasn't what it used to be. A contract I'd sworn I left on my desk would vanish, only to reappear days later in a different drawer. Financial reports I needed for meetings would go missing right before I had to present them. I'd mention it to Michael casually. "Have you seen the Henderson contract? I could have sworn I left it right here." He'd shake his head, concerned and helpful. "No, Mom. Maybe you filed it already? "You've been working so hard lately, you should take a break." And I'd smile, grateful for his concern, and tell myself he was probably right. I was working too hard. I was stressed. I was imagining things. But I wasn't imagining things. Michael was taking those documents, studying them, learning the structure of my company, the legal frameworks, the shareholding distributions. He was preparing, and I was too blind to see it. Then there were the questions, innocent at first, or so they seemed. We'd be having dinner, and Michael would casually ask, "Mom, have you updated your will recently?" I was reading an article about estate planning, and it got me thinking. Or, how exactly does the ownership structure of Miller and Associates work? Like, if something happened to you, what would happen to the company? I'd answer him openly, honestly. Why wouldn't I? He was my son. I'd built this company for him. I wanted him to understand how it all worked, how I'd structured everything to protect our legacy. I thought he was asking because he cared, because he wanted to learn, because he was thinking about our future together. I never suspected he was asking because he was planning to take it all away from me. 6 months ago, I came home late from a business trip. It was past midnight, and I was exhausted, but I'd forgotten to grab a file I needed for a morning meeting. I walked into my study, and there was Michael sitting at my desk, papers spread across the surface. My personal files, company documents, legal paperwork I kept locked in my drawer. My heart jumped. "Michael, what are you doing?" He looked up, startled for just a fraction of a second, but then that charming smile slid into place, the one that had gotten him out of trouble since he was 5 years old. "Mom, I didn't hear you come in. I was just looking for that file you mentioned last week. The Anderson proposal? I thought I could help you prep for the meeting. I should have asked why my locked drawer was open. Should have asked why he was there at midnight instead of at his own apartment. Should have listened to the small voice in my head screaming that something wasn't right. But I didn't. Because he was my son. Because I wanted to believe him. Because doubting him felt like the ultimate betrayal of the bond we'd spent 15 years building. "Oh," I said, relaxing. "That's sweet of you, honey, but it's late. Go home and get some rest. I'll handle it in the morning." He stood, hugged me, kissed my cheek. "You work too hard, Mom. I worry about you." And I'd hugged him back, feeling foolish for that split second of suspicion, feeling grateful that I had a son who cared enough to try to help. I didn't know that he'd just been copying my signature, practicing, perfecting the curves and loops until he could forge it flawlessly on any document he wanted. The meetings started after that. Business lunches Michael never mentioned. Phone calls he'd take in another room, his voice dropping to a whisper the moment I walked past. Conversations that would stop abruptly when I entered a room, leaving behind a strange, heavy silence that felt like guilt. I confronted him once. Just once. "Michael, is everything okay? You've been so secretive lately. All these meetings you won't talk about." He'd laughed, that easy, dismissive laugh that made me feel small, made me feel paranoid, made me feel like the problem was me, not him. "Mom, you're being paranoid. I'm just trying to help the business grow. I'm networking, making connections, exploring opportunities. You should be grateful I'm taking initiative. Instead of questioning me all the time, the words stung, made me feel like a controlling mother, a suspicious boss, someone who couldn't let go and trust her own son. So I backed off, apologized, told him I was proud of his initiative. And all the while, he was meeting with Richard, planning, scheming, forging documents that would strip me of everything I'd built. I trusted him because he was my son. I ignored every instinct, every warning sign, every moment of doubt because I loved him. Because doubting Michael felt like admitting I'd failed as a mother. Like admitting that the person I'd sacrificed everything for had become someone I couldn't trust. But I should have trusted my gut. Should have asked harder questions. Should have opened that locked drawer and demanded to know why it was open. Should have followed him to one of those secretive meetings and seen for myself what he was really doing. Now, sitting in my bedroom with David's words echoing in my mind, "He's been forging your signature for months. If we hadn't caught it, you would have lost everything by next week." I realized the terrible truth. The signs weren't small, they weren't subtle. They were screaming at me, and I just refused to listen. 1 week, I was 7 days away from losing everything. 7 days from Michael walking into my office with forged documents, a fake smile, and the final signature that would make him owner of Miller and Associates. 7 days from Richard's revenge being complete. And I almost let it happen because I loved my son too much to believe he could hurt me, because I chose blind faith over careful observation, because I wanted so desperately to believe that the boy I raised was still in there somewhere. But maybe he never was. Maybe Richard's poison had been there all along, dormant, waiting for the right moment to bloom. Or maybe Michael had always been capable of this, and I just didn't want to see it. Either way, I'd ignored the signs, and I almost paid the ultimate price. Have you ever ignored the warning signs because you loved someone too much? Sometimes, the people closest to us are the ones we should watch most carefully. Drop a comment if this resonates. I was still sitting on the edge of my bed when I realized I needed to know more. I called David back, my hands steadier now, my voice harder. David, you said Michael isn't working alone. You said there's someone else from my past. Tell me who. There was a long pause, the kind that makes your stomach drop because you already know what's coming. Finally, David spoke, his voice heavy. Kate, it's Richard. Your ex-husband is behind this. The room tilted. The air left my lungs, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Richard, the man who'd controlled every aspect of my life for 16 years. The man who'd made me feel worthless, small, incapable. The man who'd told me I'd never survive without him. I thought I'd escaped Richard 15 years ago. I thought I'd left him behind, his rage, his control, his suffocating presence. I'd rebuilt my life specifically to prove him wrong. And I'd succeeded. I'd thrived. I'd built an empire he said I could never build. But he'd never let go. He'd been waiting, watching, planning his revenge all along, and he'd found the perfect weapon, our son. How long? I choked out. How long has Richard been involved? David's voice was grim. From what we can tell, at least 18 months. Kate, he's been grooming Michael, poisoning him against you systematically. This wasn't spontaneous, this was calculated. Suddenly I was back in that house 15 years ago, standing with my suitcase packed, divorce papers in hand. Richard's face twisted with rage so pure I'd feared for my safety. He'd grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise, leaned in close, and whispered words that haunted me for years. You'll never make it without me, Catherine. You're nothing. You'll come crawling back within a month, and when you do, I'll make sure you have nothing left. His breath was hot against my face. I'll destroy you for this. You'll see. I'd pulled away, grabbed Michael's hand, and walked out. I hadn't looked back. And I'd spent 15 years proving him wrong, getting my degree, building my business, becoming someone he'd never believed I could be. I'd thought my success was the ultimate revenge against a man who tried to keep me small. But Richard had never accepted defeat. He'd never forgiven me for leaving, for proving him wrong, for daring to be happy without him. Instead of moving on, he'd spent years planning this, planning to use the one person I loved most to destroy me. We found extensive email correspondence between Richard and Michael, David continued. Kate, your ex-husband has been systematically turning your son against you. He convinced Michael that you were selfish, that you were hoarding wealth that rightfully belonged to him, that you cared more about the business than your own child. Each word was a knife twisting deeper. Richard knew me, knew my vulnerabilities, knew that my greatest fear was failing Michael as a mother, and he'd use that to poison my son's mind, to make Michael believe the opposite of the truth. Richard promised Michael everything: wealth, power, his father's approval, something Michael apparently craved desperately. He painted himself as the wronged father kept away by a bitter ex-wife. He told Michael you'd stolen everything in the divorce, that you'd built your company with money that should have been his. I laughed bitterly. I walked away with nothing. Richard kept everything. I built Miller and Associates from scratch. But Michael didn't know that, had never known. Because I'd never wanted to poison him against his father the way Richard had poisoned him against me. Kate, this isn't just about money, David said quietly. This is about revenge. Richard couldn't stand that you left him, couldn't stand that you succeeded, so he decided to take everything away, but not directly, through Michael, through the person you love most. The betrayal was twofold: Michael's greed, his willingness to forge my signature, to steal my company. But beneath that was Richard's calculated revenge. His puppet strings pulling Michael in directions my son might never have gone alone. Richard had turned our child into a weapon specifically designed to hurt me in the deepest way possible. This wasn't just about losing Miller and Associates. This was about Richard proving, 15 years later, that he could still control my life, that he could still destroy me, that leaving him had been the biggest mistake, just like he'd promised. I thought about all the years building my independence, my strength, my empire, all the nights working until I couldn't see straight, all the risks, the obstacles overcome. I'd done it to prove Richard wrong, and now I realized every success had only made him angrier. had only fed his need for revenge. He'd watched me succeed and plotted my fall, and he'd chosen the cruelest method possible, using my own son as the instrument of my destruction. "What else do we know?" I asked, my voice cold now. The grief would come later. Right now I needed information. "If Richard's been planning this for 18 months, what else has he done? What other traps has he set?" David hesitated. "We're still investigating. But Kate, if Richard has been this methodical, this patient, there could be other pieces we haven't uncovered. We need to assume he's thought of everything." The dread was almost physical. Richard had always been thorough, meticulous, obsessed with control. If he'd been planning this for years, there were probably layers I didn't know about yet. I thought about Michael's questions over the past year, the missing documents, the secretive meetings. How much was Michael acting alone, and how much was Richard coaching from the shadows? How many times had Richard sat with our son, feeding him lies, convincing him that betrayal was justified? And Michael had believed him, had chosen the father who'd barely been present over the mother who'd sacrificed everything, because Richard offered him something I apparently never had: approval, validation, the promise of being enough. Richard knew exactly where to strike, knew Michael felt like he was in my shadow at Miller and Associates, and Richard had used that insecurity to turn my son into someone I no longer recognized. The man I'd escaped 15 years ago had never really let me go. He'd just been waiting for the perfect opportunity to destroy me, and he'd found it in my relationship with my own son. "Kate?" David's voice pulled me back. "Are you okay?" I wasn't okay. I would probably never be okay again. But I was still here, still breathing, still capable of fighting back. "I'm here," I said, my voice steady. "What's our next move?" Because if Richard thought using Michael would finally break me, he was wrong. I'd survived Richard Miller once. I'd walked away from his control and built a life he said was impossible. And I would survive this too, even if it meant fighting both my ex-husband and my own son. Richard had made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated me 15 years ago when he told me I was nothing. And he was underestimating me now if he thought maternal love would make me weak enough to surrender. This was war. And I'd already proven once that Richard Miller couldn't defeat Catherine Miller. I was about to prove it again. Have you ever escaped someone toxic only to realize they never really let you go? The worst betrayals come from those who know exactly how to hurt us. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, staring at the woman reflected back at me. The navy dress still lay on the bed, wrinkled now from where I'd sat on it earlier. The lipstick was smeared across my lips unevenly, forgotten in the chaos of David's call. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to the edge of the dresser. The dinner. I was supposed to be at Michael's house right now, supposed to be sitting at his dining table, laughing, talking about the business, about our future together. That's what he'd said when he called 3 days ago. His voice had been warm, familiar, filled with the kind of affection that made my heart swell with maternal pride. "Mom, please come over Friday night. I need to talk to you about something important, about the business, about our future together." Those words had felt like a gift at the time, like my son finally wanted to have a serious conversation about taking on more responsibility at Miller and Associates. Like he was ready to step up, to be the partner I'd always hoped he'd become. Now those same words felt like poison dripping into an open wound, about the business, about our future together. What did that really mean? Was he planning to make me sign something under the pretense of discussing company strategy? Was there a document waiting on his dining table, disguised as a partnership agreement but actually transferring everything into his name? Was Richard going to be there, hiding in another room, ready to witness my signature, or worse? Was there a camera set up, recording equipment, ready to capture me saying something they could twist in court? Yes, Michael should have more control. I've been thinking about stepping back. Innocent statements that could be edited, manipulated, used as evidence that I'd willingly handed over my company. My stomach turned violently. I rushed to the bathroom and dry-heaved over the toilet, my body rejecting the very thought of what could have happened if I'd walked into that house tonight, if David hadn't called when he did, if I'd gone to that dinner, trusting and unsuspecting, ready to celebrate what I thought was my son's maturity. I would have lost everything. One signature, one recorded conversation, one moment of maternal trust, and Richard would have finally gotten his revenge. I stumbled back to my bedroom and called David with trembling fingers. He picked up immediately. Kate, are you okay?" His voice was tight with concern. I could hear papers rustling in the background. He was still working, probably building our case. "The dinner," I choked out. "David, I was supposed to go to Michael's house tonight. Do you think it was part of the plan?" The silence on the other end confirmed what I already knew. "Kate, listen to me carefully. Do not go to that dinner. Do not go to Michael's house. If he's desperate, if Richard is pushing him, we don't know what they might do. Stay home. Lock your doors. Let me handle this legally." "But what if I'm wrong?" I whispered, hating how weak I sounded. "What if this really was just a dinner, and I'm destroying our relationship by not showing up?" David's voice was firm, almost harsh. "Kate, he forged your signature. He tried to steal your company. Whatever relationship you think you have with Michael, it's already destroyed. He destroyed it, not you." The words hit like a physical blow, but they were true, and I needed to hear them. After we hung up, I sat on my bed, staring at my phone. Michael had texted again. "Mom, you're coming, right? I have everything ready, can't wait to see you, everything ready." The words made my skin crawl. What did he have ready? Documents? Witnesses? A script he'd rehearsed with Richard? My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial Susan Parker's number. But I needed her. Needed someone who knew me, who'd been there through the divorce, through the building of my company, through every triumph and every setback. I needed someone to tell me I wasn't going crazy. Susan answered on the second ring. "Kate, what's wrong?" Her voice was immediately alert, concerned. She knew me well enough to know I never called this late unless it was serious. "Susan, I need you. Can you come over, please? I'm on my way." 20 minutes later, Susan was sitting across from me at my kitchen table, her hand wrapped around mine, her eyes filled with the kind of fierce loyalty that comes from decades of friendship. I'd made tea, more for something to do with my hands than because I could actually drink it. The cup sat in front of me, untouched, growing cold. I told her everything. About David's call, about the forgeries, about Richard being behind it all, about the dinner invitation that now felt like a carefully laid trap. Susan listened without interrupting, her grip on my hand tightening with each new revelation. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Kate, you've survived worse than this. You survived Richard. You walked away from him with nothing and built an empire. You raised a son alone while working 2 jobs and going to school. You faced down boardrooms full of men who thought you didn't belong. You'll survive this too." But I shook my head, tears streaming down my face that I didn't bother to wipe away. "Susan, this is different. This is my son. How do I survive my own child trying to destroy me? How do I fight back against the person I love most in the world?" My voice cracked on the last word. Susan's eyes filled with tears too. "By remembering that he made this choice. Not you. He chose Richard. He chose greed. He chose to betray you. You didn't do this, Kate. He did." She squeezed my hand tighter. "And you're not going to let him win. You're not going to let Richard win, not after everything you've built." We sat in silence for a while, the tea growing colder, the kitchen clock ticking away the minutes I should have been spending at Michael's house. At the dinner that might have been my downfall, Susan finally spoke again. "You're not going tonight, right?" I shook my head. "No, David told me to stay home, to let him handle it legally." "Good." Susan's voice was firm. "Because we don't know what they were planning, and I'm not letting you walk into a trap." She paused, then asked the question I'd been asking myself since David's call. "Do you think Michael was always capable of this, or did Richard turn him into someone else?" I stared down at my cold tea, seeing my reflection distorted in the dark liquid. "I don't know," I whispered. "I've been asking myself that all night. Was it always there, this capacity for betrayal? Or did Richard plant it, water it, watch it grow until my son became unrecognizable?" The truth was, I'd probably never know. Maybe Michael had always had Richard's darkness in him, dormant, waiting for the right trigger. Or maybe Richard had systematically poisoned him over 18 months, drip by drip, until the Michael I knew was gone. Either way, the result was the same. My son had tried to destroy me, and tonight, if I'd gone to that dinner, he might have succeeded. The next morning, I sat across from David Lawson in his law office, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from shaking. The conference room was cold, sterile, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city I'd spent 15 years conquering. But right now, all I could see was the stack of documents David was spreading across the polished table between us. "I need you to prepare yourself, Kate," David said quietly, his expression grave. "What I'm about to show you, it's going to be difficult." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I'd barely slept the night before. Susan had stayed until dawn, making sure I ate something, making sure I didn't fall apart completely. But now, sitting here in the harsh fluorescent light, I felt like I was about to. David pulled out the first document. "This is a stock transfer agreement, dated 3 weeks ago. It transfers 80% of Miller and Associates from you to Michael." He slid it toward me. "Look at the signature." What would have happened if I'd gone? I'd never know for sure. But as I lay in bed that night, Susan sleeping in the guest room down the hall, I couldn't stop imagining it. The forged documents waiting on Michael's dining table. Richard's lawyer hiding in another room with a recorder. My son's practiced smile as he guided me toward my own destruction. And the signature I would have given so willingly, believing I was building our future together when I was actually signing away everything I'd worked for. I stared down at the paper. There, at the bottom, was my signature. Catherine Miller. The loops and curves, the slight upward tilt at the end, it was perfect. Identical to how I'd signed my name for 40 years. If someone had shown me this document without context, I would have sworn under oath that I'd signed it myself. But I hadn't. Michael had. My son had practiced my signature so many times, so meticulously, that he could replicate it flawlessly. The level of premeditation made my stomach turn. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was months, maybe years of planning, of studying my handwriting, of practicing in secret until he could forge my name without hesitation. "There are more," David said, pulling out another stack. "Falsified board meeting minutes claiming you voted to transfer control to Michael. Fake correspondence from your email address, spoofed but convincing, where you discuss stepping down due to health concerns." He paused, letting that sink in. "We'll come to an arrangement that works for everyone." I stared at him, seeing him clearly for the first time in years. Not as the man who'd controlled my life, not as the husband I'd once tried to please, but as exactly what he was, a manipulator who'd lost his favorite toy and couldn't stand it. "You used our son to try to destroy me, Richard. You poisoned him against me for 18 months. You coached him on how to forge my signature, how to steal my company, how to ruin me." My voice was steady, controlled. "And you almost succeeded. But I'm not the woman you married. I'm not afraid of you anymore. Leave, now." Richard's mask slipped. The smile vanished, replaced by the rage I remembered from our worst fights. His face twisted, turning red, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "You self-righteous bitch. You think you're so much better than me? You think you won by leaving? You took my son. You turned him against me. And when I finally get him back, when he finally sees what you really are, you try to destroy him." The brutal rebuilding, 2 jobs, night school, clawing my way into the business world. The success I'd built from scratch, proving Richard wrong about everything. And then the betrayal. My own son forging my signature, conspiring with the man who'd once controlled every aspect of my life. But I'd survived it all, and somewhere in that survival, I'd discovered something important. My identity wasn't defined by Michael's choices. It wasn't defined by Richard's revenge, or his hatred, or his need to see me broken. I was Catherine Miller, self-made, resilient, unbroken, regardless of what they'd tried to do to me. That evening, I went home to my empty house, walked through rooms that felt too quiet, too still. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood in the living room, looking at the photos on the wall. There was one of Michael and me at his college graduation, both of us grinning, his arm around my shoulders. I'd thought about taking it down 100 times. "The evidence of forgery and fraud is irrefutable," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "The injunction is made permanent. All attempted transfers are voided. Mrs. Catherine Miller retains full ownership and control of Miller and Associates." He paused, looking directly at Michael and Richard. "Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the district attorney for potential criminal charges. This court is adjourned." The gavel fell. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. I'd won. Miller and Associates was mine, protected, secure. Justice had been served. But as I watched Michael stand and walk out of the courtroom beside Richard, his shoulders slumped, his face pale with shame and defeat. All I felt was emptiness. I'd saved my company, but I'd lost my son, and no judge's ruling could change that. Every time I thought about calling him, I remembered the emails. She deserves it for always putting the business before me. I remembered his face in the courtroom, pale and guilty but still lying, still trying to justify the unjustifiable. A knock on my office door pulled me from my thoughts. Susan walked in without waiting for an answer, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the concerned expression she'd been giving me a lot lately. "Working late again?" she asked, setting 1 cup on my desk. "You know the company won't fall apart if you go home before midnight." I smiled weakly. Old habits. Susan sat down across from me, studying my face. "Have you thought about reaching out to him, to Michael?" The question I'd been dreading. I shook my head slowly. "He knows where I am, Susan. If he wants to apologize, to explain, to make amends, I'll listen. But I won't chase him. I spent 15 years giving him everything, sacrificing everything. Now he has to decide if he wants his mother in his life." I'd barely hung up with David when my phone rang again. Michael's name flashed on the screen. My hand hovered over the answer button, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let him panic, to give him a taste of the abandonment he'd made me feel. But another part, the part that was still his mother, needed to hear his voice. I answered. "Hello, Michael." "Mom!" His voice was high-pitched, panicked, so different from his usual confident tone. "Mom, please, we need to talk. This is all a misunderstanding. The injunction, the court hearing, it's all blown out of proportion. Dad was just trying to help me secure my future. The mention of Richard, of Dad, made something snap inside me. Stop." My voice came out cold, harder than I'd ever spoken to my son. "You forged my signature, Michael. You created fake documents. You tried to steal my company. There's no misunderstanding. There's only what you did and the consequences you're about to face." I paused, letting the silence stretch between us. Through mutual acquaintances, through the business community's endless gossip. Michael and Richard had a falling out almost immediately after the trial. Richard had blamed Michael for everything, for being weak under cross-examination, for not sticking to the script, for botching the plan. The father who'd promised Michael wealth and power, who'd convinced him that betraying me was justified, had abandoned him the moment he failed, cast him aside like a broken tool that was no longer useful. I wondered if Michael understood now, if he'd finally realized that Richard never loved him, only used him, that his father had seen him not as a son, but as a weapon to wield against me, that everything Richard had promised was a lie designed to turn Michael into the instrument of my destruction. But even if Michael understood, even if he regretted what he'd done, he hadn't reached out. And I hadn't reached out to him. The wound was too deep, too raw. But something in me needed to face him, needed to prove, to myself more than to him, that I wasn't afraid anymore. I opened the door but didn't invite him in, stood in the doorway with my hand on the frame blocking his entrance. "What do you want, Richard?" His smile widened, as if my coldness amused him. "Catherine, you're looking well. I was hoping we could talk." Adult to adult. He gestured toward my living room. "May I come in? This is a private matter, about our son." "No." The word was flat, final. "Say what you came to say, then leave." Richard's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Catherine, let's be reasonable about this. Michael is our son, our child. Do you really want to destroy him over some paperwork? Over a misunderstanding between a mother and son trying to plan for the future?" His voice was smooth, practiced, designed to make me doubt myself. "We can work this out privately. Drop the injunction. Sit down with Michael and me." "You're destroying him," I said quietly, "by using him as a weapon against me, by teaching him that betrayal and manipulation are acceptable, by turning him into you." Richard stepped closer, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "I'll make sure you lose everything. Michael will testify that you were mentally unstable, that you didn't know what you were signing, that you were incompetent to run the company. By the time we're done, you'll be exactly where you should have been 15 years ago, broken and powerless and alone." I looked him in the eye, seeing the hatred there, the need to control me even after all these years. And I felt nothing. No fear, no doubt, no regret. Goodbye, Richard. I stepped back and slammed the door in his face, locked it, and listened to him stand there for a moment, breathing hard, before finally walking away. My hands were shaking, my heart was racing. But I'd done it. I'd faced Richard Miller and refused to bend, refused to be intimidated. "David will see you in court." "Mom, please," he started, but I couldn't listen anymore. Couldn't let him manipulate me with his panic and his excuses. I hung up. For the first time in his 28 years, I'd cut my son off mid-sentence. My hand trembled as I set the phone down. It hurt. God, it hurt. But it was necessary, because if I let him talk, if I let him cry and plead and make promises, I might weaken, and I couldn't afford to be weak. Not now. The next morning, there was a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. Susan had left early for work, and David was at his office preparing for the hearing. I looked through the peephole and felt my blood turn to ice. Richard Miller stood on my doorstep, wearing an expensive suit and that same manipulative smile I remembered from 15 years ago. The smile that used to make me feel small, controlled, worthless. I considered not opening the door, considered calling the police and having him removed from my property. "Let's do this. She deserves it for always putting the business before me. I've spent my whole life watching her care more about Miller and Associates than her own son. It's time she understands what it feels like to lose everything." The paper slipped from my fingers and fluttered to the table. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what I'd just read. Michael actually believed I'd chosen the business over him. He believed every lie Richard had whispered in his ear. He believed that the company I built for him, was somehow proof that I didn't love him. Every late night I worked was so he could have opportunities I never had. Every risk I took was to secure his future. Every dollar I earned was to make sure he'd never struggle the way I did, and he saw it as abandonment, as proof that I cared more about success than about being his mother. Richard had twisted everything, poisoned every memory, and Catherine Miller, 63 years old, self-made, betrayed but unbowed, continued to build her legacy. Not for Michael, not anymore. That dream had died in a courtroom 3 months ago, but for myself. For the woman who'd refused to stay broken, for the fighter who'd proven that betrayal might wound, but it would never define her. Because I'd finally learned the most important lesson of all, I didn't need Michael's love to know I was a good mother. I didn't need Richard's approval to know I was strong. I didn't need anyone's validation to know my worth. I was enough. I'd always been enough. And that knowledge, that unshakable certainty in my own value, was something no one could ever forge, steal, or take away from me. Kate's story reminds us that betrayal doesn't define us. Our response to it does. If this story moved you, please subscribe to hear more stories of strength, survival, and justice. And remember, you are stronger than you know. And then I told my story. Walking away from Richard with nothing, building Miller and Associates from scratch, working 2 jobs and going to school at night, all to give Michael a better life. Every decision I made was to secure my son's future, I said, my voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. Every risk I took, every late night, every sacrifice, it was all for him. I built that company so he'd never have to depend on anyone the way I depended on Richard. Richard's lawyer, Morse, stood for cross-examination, his smile sharp and condescending. "Mrs. Miller, isn't it true that you refused to make your son a partner in the company despite his years of involvement? That you controlled every aspect of the business and refused to let him have any real authority?" He paused dramatically. "Some might say you were using the company to maintain control over your son to keep him dependent on you." I met his eyes calmly. "I built Miller and Associates to provide for my son, yes, but I also wanted him to earn his place, to learn the business, to prove himself capable, not because I didn't love him, but because I did. I'm not going to let them win. I'm going to fight, not for revenge, not even for the company really, but because I refuse to be the victim Richard always said I was." I looked at Susan, gratitude welling up inside me. "Thank you for being here, for telling me what I needed to hear instead of what I wanted to hear." Susan pulled me into a hug. "That's what friends are for. And Kate, you're going to get through this. You're going to win, because you're the strongest woman I know, and Richard Miller made a fatal mistake 15 years ago." She pulled back, smiling through her tears. "He let you go, and you became someone he could never control again. For the first time since David's call, I felt something other than grief and shock. I felt power, the power that came from knowing who I was and refusing to let anyone, not Richard, not Michael, not anyone, make me forget it. I was Catherine Miller, self-made, resilient, unbreakable, and I was ready to fight. Susan nodded, accepting my answer without judgment. You did the right thing, Kate, fighting back, standing up. You saved what you built. You refused to be a victim. I turned back to the window, watching the sun set over the city. I saved my company, yes, but I lost my son. Some days I wonder if it was worth it, if keeping Miller and Associates was worth losing Michael forever. It was worth it, Susan said firmly, her voice brooking no argument. Because you refused to let Richard win. You refused to let him use your own son to destroy you. And maybe one day Michael will realize what he threw away. Maybe he'll understand that you weren't the villain Richard painted you to be. She paused. But even if he doesn't, even if he never apologizes, you're still standing. That matters, Kate. You survived. You fought. You won. I thought about her words as she left, thought about the journey that had brought me here, the divorce 15 years ago, walking out with nothing but Michael's hand in mine. The room smelled of old wood and tension, the kind of thick silence that comes before something breaks. Judge William Harris entered, stern and methodical, his black robes flowing behind him. He was in his 60s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Be seated, he commanded, and we all obeyed. I forced myself to look across the aisle. Michael sat beside Richard and their lawyer, a slick-looking man named Daniel Morse, who specialized in defending the indefensible. My son looked pale, younger than his 28 years, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Our eyes met for just a moment. I searched his face for remorse, for recognition of what he'd done. But Michael looked away first, shame or defiance, I couldn't tell which, coloring his cheeks. David stood, his voice clear and confident. Your Honor, we are here because of a calculated scheme to defraud Mrs. Catherine Miller of her company through forgery, fraud, and conspiracy. 3 months later, I sat in my office at Miller & Associates, looking out at the city that had witnessed my rise, my fall, and my fight back. The legal battle was over. The company was secure, the injunction made permanent, my ownership uncontested. Judge Harris had ruled in my favor, and the district attorney was still deciding whether to pursue criminal charges against Michael and Richard. I should have felt triumphant, victorious, but mostly I just felt tired. The office was quiet. It was late afternoon, most of the staff had gone home. I'd thrown myself into work these past 3 months, signing new contracts, expanding into new markets, proving that Miller & Associates was stronger than ever. But the victory felt hollow, because Michael hadn't spoken to me since the trial. Not a single word, not a text, not a call, not even a message passed through someone else. He'd simply vanished from my life as completely as if he'd never existed. I'd heard things, of course. Michael even created medical records suggesting you were experiencing early cognitive decline. My head snapped up. What? My voice came out strangled, barely recognizable. David's jaw was tight with anger. He was building a case that you were mentally unfit to run the company, that you were making the decision to step down voluntarily, but that it was necessary because you were no longer capable of sound judgment. The room tilted. Michael wasn't just trying to steal my company, he was trying to destroy my reputation, to make everyone believe I was losing my mind, to make me look weak, incompetent, exactly the way Richard had always said I was. David continued, his voice steady but laced with fury. Richard's fingerprints are all over this, Kate. He hired a lawyer, Daniel Morse, not exactly known for his ethics, to draft these documents. We subpoenaed their communications, and we found email correspondence between Richard and Michael going back 18 months. 18 months. A year and a half. You worked yourself to exhaustion, 2 jobs, night school, building a company from scratch, all for him. Her voice cracked with emotion. Michael had choices, Kate. He could have talked to you. He could have told you he felt neglected. He could have been honest. Instead, he chose to conspire with the man who abused you. He chose his father's poison. That's not your fault. I wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that I'd done my best, that Michael's choices were his own. But the guilt was crushing me. I should have seen it, should have known that Richard was poisoning him against me. What kind of mother doesn't notice her own son being manipulated? Susan was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I tell you something I've never told you before?" I nodded, wiping my eyes. "You know I have a sister, had a sister," she corrected herself. "Laura. We haven't spoken in 12 years. I looked at her, surprised. Susan rarely talked about her family. What happened? Our mother died and left us her house. The woman who'd proven Richard wrong about everything. "This isn't just about Michael or Richard anymore, is it?" I said slowly, the realization crystallizing. "This is about me refusing to be a victim ever again." Susan nodded. "Exactly. You didn't build that company out of greed, Kate. You built it to prove to yourself, and to Michael, that you were strong, that you could survive anything, and now you need to fight to keep it. Not because you're greedy or heartless, but because letting them take it would be letting Richard win. And you didn't survive the last 15 years just to give that man the satisfaction of destroying you." I took a deep breath, feeling something hard and cold settle in my core. Determination, resolve, the same feeling I'd had the day I walked out on Richard, the same feeling I'd had when I signed the lease on my first office, the same feeling that had carried me through every obstacle, every setback, every moment I wanted to give up. "You're right," I said, my voice stronger now. That evening, Susan came back to my house without me even asking. She let herself in with the spare key I'd given her years ago, found me sitting in my living room in the dark, staring at nothing. I hadn't turned on the lights, hadn't eaten, hadn't moved since I got home from David's office hours earlier. Susan flipped on a lamp, and I flinched at the sudden brightness. She didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside me on the couch, close enough that our shoulders touched, and waited. That's what I loved about Susan. She knew when to push and when to just be present. "I read the emails," I finally said, my voice hollow. "Michael thinks I chose the business over him, that I was a terrible mother who cared more about success than her own son." The words tasted bitter in my mouth. "Susan, what if he's right? What if I was so focused on building Miller and Associates that I missed what was happening to him?" Susan turned to face me, her expression hard in a way I rarely saw. "Kate, stop. You know what Richard is." She was right. Michael knew me better than anyone, knew how much I loved him, how much I'd sacrificed for him, and he'd used that knowledge, that trust, to get close enough to steal everything. "But you survived your sister's betrayal," I said quietly. "How?" Susan smiled sadly. I remembered who I was before she hurt me. I remembered that her choices didn't define my worth, and I reminded myself that letting her win, letting the betrayal break me, would be giving her exactly what she wanted. She squeezed my hand tighter. "You survived Richard once. You built an empire from nothing. You'll survive this too, because that's who Catherine Miller is. You're a survivor." Something shifted in my chest, a spark of the woman I'd been before David's phone call. Before I knew my son had betrayed me, the woman who'd walked away from an abusive marriage with nothing and refused to stay broken. The woman who'd built Miller and Associates from a tiny rented office into a thriving company. "You've always known. He's a man who cannot stand to see you succeed. He spent 16 years trying to convince you that you were nothing, and when you proved him wrong, it destroyed him." She paused, her voice softening slightly. "But Michael is your son. He made a choice, a terrible, selfish choice. But he's an adult and he chose greed over love. You need to accept that." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. But where did I go wrong? Was I too focused on work? Did I miss something? Did I fail him as a mother? The questions I'd been asking myself all day finally spilled out. I worked so hard to give him everything. But what if that was the problem? What if I was never there when he needed me? Susan grabbed my hand, her grip almost painful. "Stop. Just stop. You gave that boy everything. You walked away from Richard with nothing and rebuilt your entire life so Michael could have opportunities you never had. Putting it in a drawer, hiding it away, erasing him from my visual history. But I didn't. Because that moment had been real, even if what came after wasn't. That version of Michael, young, hopeful, proud of his mother, had existed, even if Richard had eventually poisoned him beyond recognition. I wasn't going to erase our history, but I wasn't going to let it define my future either. I thought about the lawyer's call that had shattered my world months ago, David's grave voice. "Kate, you need to sit down, it's about Michael." I remembered the fear, the disbelief, the soul-crushing pain of learning my son had betrayed me. But I also remembered what came after, the strength I found, the courage to fight back, the refusal to surrender to Richard's revenge or Michael's greed. I walked to the window, glass of wine in hand, and looked out at the city lights sparkling below. Somewhere out there, Michael was living his life without me. Somewhere out there, Richard was probably plotting his next move, his next attempt to hurt me. But I was still here. Refused to let him make me feel small ever again. That night, Susan came back to stay with me. She found me sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the evidence David had given me. The forged signatures, the emails. Michael's words, "She deserves it for always putting the business before me." "Can't sleep?" Susan asked gently, sitting down across from me. I shook my head. Wednesday morning I have to walk into that courtroom and face my son. I have to listen to him lie, watch him try to justify what he did, and I have to be strong enough not to break. My voice cracked. "Susan, I'm not afraid of losing the company. I'm afraid of losing the last piece of the boy I raised, because once we walk into that courtroom, there's no going back. Michael and I, whatever we had, it'll be over." Susan reached across the table and took my hand. "Kate, it was already over. The moment he forged your signature, the moment he conspired with Richard, it was over. You're not destroying your relationship with Michael." While I was mentoring Michael, teaching him the business, trusting him with more responsibility, he was plotting with Richard behind my back. David pulled out printed emails, highlighting certain passages. Richard coached him on every step. How to forge your signature, how to create believable fake documents, how to manipulate board members, how to make it look legitimate. He slid one email toward me. This one was sent 4 months ago. I picked it up with trembling hands. Richard's words were there in black and white, clinical and cruel. "Your mother thinks she's so strong, so independent. Let's show her what happens when you take away everything she's built. She took everything from me. Now we take everything from her. This is about justice, Michael. She needs to learn that leaving me was the biggest mistake of her life." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes, but it was the next email, Michael's response, that broke something inside me. David pointed to it. "Read his reply. I'm ready, Dad." Susan stayed with me that night, refusing to leave me alone. We didn't talk much more. There wasn't much left to say, but her presence was a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone in this nightmare. As midnight approached, my phone buzzed one more time. "Michael, Mom? You didn't show up. Are you okay? I'm worried. Call me." I stared at the message for a long time. The concern in his words felt so genuine, so real, but I couldn't trust it anymore. Couldn't trust him, because the boy who'd written those words was the same boy who'd forged my signature, the same boy who'd conspired with his father to steal everything I'd built. I turned off my phone without responding, and somewhere in the darkness of his house, surrounded by whatever trap he'd prepared, Michael was probably calling Richard, panicking, realizing that their plan had somehow been exposed, that the dinner that was supposed to seal my fate had become the moment I chose to save myself. Turned my sacrifices into crimes and my love into neglect. And Michael had believed him. Chosen to believe him, because believing Richard meant he didn't have to feel guilty about what they were doing to me. I looked up at David, and something inside me shifted. The grief, the shock, the heartbreak, it all crystallized into something harder. Colder. What do we do? My voice was steady now, devoid of emotion. How do we stop them? David's expression softened slightly, recognizing the change in me. "We file an emergency injunction Monday morning to freeze all company assets. We present this evidence to the court. Kate, we have everything we need. The forged signatures, the fake documents, the email trail connecting Richard to the scheme. They can't win. Not with this evidence." I nodded slowly, my mind already shifting into survival mode. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't even about justice, not really. This was about refusing to let Richard Miller win, refusing to let him use my own son to destroy me. Monday morning, David Lawson filed an emergency injunction with the court. By noon, all assets of Miller and Associates were frozen. No transfers could be made, no stock could be sold, no signatures, forged or real, could change ownership. The company I'd built was locked down tight, protected by court order while we prepared to fight. David called me with the news. "It's done, Kate. Judge William Harris granted the injunction. We have a hearing scheduled for Wednesday morning, 48 hours from now." His voice was cautiously optimistic. "We present the evidence of forgery, the email correspondence, everything. This is moving fast, which is good for us. They won't have time to cover their tracks or manufacture new lies. 48 hours. 2 days until I'd face my son in court. 2 days until I'd have to look Michael in the eye and watch him try to justify what he'd done. 2 days until the world would know that Catherine Miller's own son had tried to destroy her. Still standing, still building, still refusing to be the broken woman Richard had always said I was. I survived an abusive marriage that tried to convince me I was worthless. I built an empire from nothing, proving every one of Richard's predictions wrong. I fought off a calculated attack from the two people who should have protected me most, my ex-husband and my own son, and I won. They tried to break me, I whispered to the night, my breath fogging the cold window glass. But I'm unbreakable. The words felt like a promise, like an oath, like the truth I'd spent 15 years proving and would spend the rest of my life defending. The next morning, I was back at my desk at Miller & Associates, reviewing new contracts, planning future expansions, meeting with clients who respected me, employees who valued me, partners who saw me as the capable businesswoman I'd become. Life went on, the business thrived, the world kept turning. It wasn't much. A small place in the suburbs worth maybe $300,000. But Laura decided she deserved more than half because she'd visited Mom more often toward the end. Susan's voice was bitter. She forged documents, claimed Mom had promised her 70%, hired a lawyer, took me to court, and when I proved the documents were fake, when I won, she told everyone I was a greedy, heartless woman who'd stolen our mother's house. I squeezed her hand. Susan, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I never told you because I was ashamed that my own sister could betray me like that. Ashamed that family, blood, didn't mean what I thought it meant. She looked at me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. But here's what I learned, Kate. Family doesn't mean they can't hurt you. Sometimes family hurts you the most because they know exactly where to strike. They know your weaknesses, your fears, your blind spots. And if they choose to, they can use that knowledge to destroy you. The words settled over me like a cold blanket. My voice was firm. I wanted him to have the skills to succeed, not just inherit something he didn't understand. That's not control, Mr. Morse. That's preparation. That's love. The lawyer sat down, his attempt to paint me as controlling falling flat. Then Michael was called to the stand. He walked up slowly, his face ashen, and I watched my son swear to tell the truth, knowing he was about to lie. His lawyer tried to portray him as a devoted son who'd only wanted to help modernize the company, who'd been trying to secure his rightful inheritance. But the moment David stood for cross-examination, I saw Michael's confidence crumble. David presented the emails, read them aloud in the silent courtroom. Richard's words, "Let's show her what happens when you take away everything she's built." And Michael's response, "I'm ready, Dad. Let's do this. She deserves it." I watched Michael's face as his own words condemned him, refusing to become the broken, powerless woman he'd always said I was. "Do it," I said firmly. "File everything. I want them to know that I'm not the woman Richard married. I'm not going to roll over and let them take what's mine." David smiled grimly. "I know you're not. That's why we're going to win this." As I left his office an hour later, armed with copies of the evidence, I felt strangely calm. The shock was gone, replaced by cold determination. Michael and Richard had underestimated me. They'd assumed I'd be too heartbroken, too devastated by my son's betrayal to fight back. They'd assumed maternal love would make me weak. They were wrong. Maternal love had made me strong enough to walk away from an abusive marriage, strong enough to build an empire from nothing, and strong enough to fight my own son if that's what survival required. If this story is making your heart race, hit that subscribe button. Justice is coming, and you won't want to miss it. He presented the evidence methodically: forged signatures, falsified transfer documents, fake board meeting minutes, fraudulent emails. The email correspondence between Richard and Michael, 18 months of planning laid bare for the court to see. Judge Harris examined each document with careful attention, his expression growing darker with each page. When David presented the emails, Richard's venom and Michael's eager complicity, the judge's jaw tightened. "These communications are admitted into evidence," he said grimly. Then David called me to the stand. I walked up on trembling legs, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth, as if I would do anything else, as if the truth wasn't the only weapon I had left. David's questions were straightforward. I recounted the missing documents, Michael's strange questions, the secretive behavior I'd dismissed. I described the moment David called me, the dinner invitation that now felt like a trap. He already did that. She squeezed my hand. Now you're just protecting yourself. And there's no shame in that. I nodded, tears sliding down my cheeks. She was right. But knowing she was right didn't make it hurt any less. 48 hours. 2 days until I faced my son in court and fought for everything I'd built. 2 days until the world saw the truth about Michael Miller and Richard Miller and the conspiracy they'd created. 2 days until I proved, once and for all, that Catherine Miller couldn't be broken. Not by Richard, not by betrayal, not even by her own son. The courtroom showdown is next. If you're invested in Kate's fight, like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Wednesday morning arrived cold and gray, matching the dread that had settled in my chest. I sat in the courtroom beside David Lawson, my hands folded in my lap, my back straight, refusing to show the terror churning inside me. Watched him try to stammer out excuses, to deflect blame onto Richard, to claim he'd been manipulated. But the evidence was overwhelming. The forged signatures, the fake documents, the detailed planning that spanned 18 months. "Mr. Miller," David said quietly, "did you or did you not forge your mother's signature on these stock transfer documents?" Michael's mouth opened and closed. "My father. He said it was the only way to protect my inheritance. He said she was planning to cut me out." "Answer the question. Did you forge her signature?" "Yes," Michael whispered, "but I didn't understand what I was—" "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Harris called for Richard to testify, but Richard's lawyer declined. Richard sat there, silent and rigid, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. He wouldn't speak because speaking meant admitting involvement, but his silence was its own admission. Judge Harris reviewed the evidence one final time, then looked up at the courtroom.